If you have two shoes, please sell one and buy a sword. If you have two trousers, please sell one and buy a sword. Because now it is time for revolution. And this revolution is no longer on streets. This revolution is not about burning cars. This revolution is in the mind. It is about building our own cars, selling them to make money. Peace and power, freedom and decolonization to all African people from wherever you find yourself. It is always a pleasure to have you on our weekly rendezvous where we talk about African liberation and African emancipation. My name is King Kabbalah from the African Continental Unity Party, the only Pan-African movement that many African people identify themselves with is the ACUP. We call it the People's Agenda. It's not agenda of the elites, but it's the agenda of the African masses. So thank you once again. Today we are going to continue on the topic that we started some time ago about the tools of African liberation. The tools for African liberation. This is very important. We have explained on the foundation of the subject itself why we are talking about the tools, why the tools are important. And if you haven't listened or watched the video that we made about the tools as an introduction to this topic, we invite you to go back and watch the video about the tools of our liberation, mostly the introduction of it. So today we're gonna just jump quickly to discuss about the first tool that we believe is important for the liberation and the emancipation of Africa and of African people. And the most, I should say, the easiest way to figure out what are the tools that we can devise for ourselves as African people is to see what were the tools and what are the tools that the imperialists or those who conquered Africa, what were the tools that they used and what are the tools that are still being used by them today to keep Africa in the condition of subjection. And when we discover the tools that they've used and the tools that they are still using today, it will be easier for us to figure out then what can be our own tools for the liberation and emancipation of Africa. And what we will have to do when we find the tools that the imperialists used, we'll definitely have to use the same tools but use them in a different way than what they've used, you see, so that we can elevate ourselves. Because if you understand it like analytically, is simply as a person using the force. Let's say a person is applying a certain force on you to put you down, right? So what you need to do to work up, if you use physics, is about using the very same force but now in a different direction. That's what we have to do as African people in order to change our situation. So that being said, when we look in the history, we see that the number one tool, or I'm not saying number one tool in terms of when first it was used, but the number one tools in terms of its effectiveness, its importance, or its impact on the African culture, African way of life, and African reality, generally speaking. And that tool was the tool of education. As you know, education is the preparation of the future generation. So the way you used education is also depending on what you are expecting to see from the future generation. If you want to create a generation of people who are dumb, people who are stupid, people who are disengaged, dissented from their own reality, their own culture, their own perspective, then you will have to use the education in certain way. Equally, if we are interested to see a people or a future generation being the future of people who are being a generation rather of the people who are engaged, people who are committed to the agenda of Africa, people who are loyal to Africa, and people who are really centered on the understanding of their own culture, people who are conscious, in other words, then we'll have to find another way to use the education to achieve that objective. Now, when we look at the way that the imperialists used education, you definitely realize that it makes sense for Africa of today be what it is today, especially when we have never questioned the foundation of the educational system that we have received from the Western imperialism. Now, for you to understand this, I want to give you one simple case about, I think his name was Hendrik Verwoerd. Hendrik Verwoerd was a South African apartheid official who was in charge of education. He's actually the architects of the Bantu education. Bantu education was a type of education that was designed for African people in South Africa. As I said, if you want to expect something from a people, you have to prepare the education in a certain way. And if you want to expect something else from people in the future, there's also a way that you need to draft, you need to structure the education so that you can produce the result that you want. Remember, education is defined as a second nature. Education that you go through becomes your second nature, right? So if you want to produce a type of personality or of characters out of people, you don't have to go far. You don't have to build jails. You don't have to do whatever else except focusing on the education of those people, especially younger generation. Now, this Verwoerd guy, when he was about to take charge of the education of the black people, he said something fundamental. He said, when I take charge of the black education, of black people's education, I will transform it so that black people are taught from childhood that equality with Europeans, or equality of white people rather, is not something that belongs to them. It's not something that they can expect. This is what he said. I mean, this explains exactly the way that he went on in designing the education of black people in South Africa. So he said it clear. I mean, once I take charge of the black people's education, I will transform it so that black people are taught from childhood. It means so that the culture of black people, all things happening in the society or in the environment of black people, the media, the culture, the commercials, the publicities, the television, everything, the music, everything is made so that black people are convinced from their deep understanding, from their subconsciousness. They are convinced, they are persuaded that equality with white people is not for them. That is what he said. And that is exactly what he did. And mind you, it's not just in South Africa. This was a pattern followed everywhere where there was colonialism, imperialism around the continent. In the Congo, you can expect the very same thing. It was done in Algeria, in Burkina Faso. So when imperialists took charge of the education after they had conquered Africa, they made sure that they don't have to deal with Africans who are self-aware of themselves, who have awareness of themselves, Africans who are conscious of their reality, of their future, of what they have to become in the future, and of their responsibility in the building of that future. You see, so in reality, the Western imperialism wanted a passive African who cannot take parts in the designing of his future. He has to sit passively and wait for white men to decide what Africans need to be, need to become, what Africans need to wear, need to feed themselves with, all those kind of stuff. And the black person need to look now to the white man for whatever that he needed. You see, so, and this had to be done perfectly through the education, because if you want to force people can resist, and people will sooner realize that you are oppressing them, and they will resist. But through the education, is like a sleeping pill that you drop in the people's brains bit by bit, until you create a narrative or a culture of obedience, a culture of a people who cannot engage themselves to solve their problems, but they have to look to you for whatever that they need in their lives. So this has been the education that was, or that is still somewhere somehow given to the African people. And even at the time of independence, you must understand, black people were not educated before, long time before the independence. The higher education or university program was introduced in Africa like 3 or 4 years before the independence period, right? Like in the Congo, during the time of independence in the Congo, we had a population of 15 million people, but among those people you had only about 8 people who had a university education. So it means that education, university education, whereby you produce scientists, you produce thinkers, you produce philosophers, was not allowed to black people before that. The only education that was there at a high level was to worship, or education that encouraged the worship of white persons. So these black people, like 8 of them within 15 million, had to take charge of a country of 15 million. You can imagine how complex was that task. And the reality was they were prepared in order to take over the responsibility or the duties that the white people were doing during the colonialism or colonial period, and continue to work on behalf of white people. They were not prepared to eventually work for black people or for the masses of black people, because education at that time, even until now, education is still, especially university education, is still defined as a way for a black person to distance himself from black culture, black way of life, because that is deemed backward according to Western way or Western view, right? So once you go to the university, you become like closer to the white people. So these few Negroes were prepared to be closer to the white person, so that white person can trust them, because they've been educated, they've come closer to the white person, and then they can now work on behalf of the white imperialism and continue in the project of the continuation plunder of African resources, as the African people were to remain languishing in poverty and in misery, you can name it. So as it's said, there's always a side to, another side to every story. I mean, there's always a good side, or sometimes also bad side to everything that you do. So they didn't get exactly what they were expecting out of these few Africans who were educated. Kwame Nkrumah seized the education of white people and changed it into a tool for African liberation. Lumumba grasped the education given to him by the white people to serve white people and made it into a tool for African liberation. Sekou Touré, so Thomas Sankara. So you had people on the continent who took that same education that was given to them and changed it, right, to fight now for the liberation of Africa. So that's what happened. But those people were sooner or quickly destroyed. Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown. Lumumba was assassinated by CIA and Americans and Belgians. Sekou Touré was under sanctions. All these people, or this generation of African leaders who changed the perspective by adopting a different trajectory by using the education to serve their people, were eventually removed systematically or through brutality. They were now replaced with other Negroes who will now have had to serve the Western agenda, and that's the reality that we have known in Africa up until today. So we have a responsibility to change the education, to look deeper into our education or educational program and curriculum and stuff like that, see what it fits to help Africa at this moment and what is not fit to help Africa, and remove it. Why don't we study Sheikh Anta Diop in education? Why don't we study Imhotep? Why don't we study Ptahhotep? Why don't we study our ancestors? Why do we have to go to YouTube to look into this kind of things? Simply because the educational system is still functioning as a colonial education. So you may say that, well, we have engineers, we have this. Well, of course, all these people are prepared to be agents of capitalism. They are there to be the tools that the capitalist is using. So when you look deeply in the current education, Western education that we have now, you have education that is preparing people to becoming the tools. Because normally education is supposed to be the tool in the hand of the person who receive that education. So when I go into education, I get educated. That education I receive must be the tool in my hand to change my situation, to improve the situation of my people, and to take my people out of misery. But the current education, when you look at it, is not given to us to become as a tool. It's actually transforming us so that we are the tools of the capitalist industry. You go into education, you get your education as an engineer. To do what? To be a productive piece, a cog in the capitalist industry, right? You go and you get educated as a doctor. To do what? To be a piece in the system of capitalists, to further the capitalism system, not to fight for your people. And that's the reason why education always, in the current context, distance yourself from your village people, from your community, from those you deem uneducated, those we look as dirty, as uneducated, as whatever we think about them, because we want to associate ourselves with a certain class of people who have been educated, and that class of people is always branded by whitey thing, behind it. So these are the serious shortcomings about the current educational system that we are going through as African people, and we cannot rebuild Africa as a global power base with the current education which is not the tool in our hands, but which makes us the tool for the capitalist industry. You see, we said that Pan-Africanism is an agenda of African people. So it means it needs the involvement of all African people so that we can rebuild Africa as a global power base. And that requires an educational system that links us with our people. Education that connects us with our people, not education that separates us from our people. Education that really draw us near our traditional chiefs, who are the custodians of our culture and tradition, who know much secrets about African culture and tradition. We need that kind of education. And when we have that kind of education, what it does, it builds in us the confidence, it builds in us the confidence, the pride of who we are as African people, and it gives us the courage to work for ourselves, to consider that the only valuable thing and the most important thing that we have in this world is Africa, and is our identity as African people. Not an education that makes us to look at ourselves, to look at our identity as something to be ashamed of. So that we need to begin, bleaching our skin, begin, trying to find all ways to imitate white people than to be African people, speaking languages of white people more than we speak our own languages. So we have a lot to talk. We can spend hours to explain the shortcomings of the educational system that we have received from the oppressors. And the bottom line here, we cannot go too much into detail to explain what education is really supposed to fulfill in the lives of the people, so that it works as a tool that empowers people to achieve their dreams and change their reality. So there's not much time to that. Maybe we will come with another video to speak in the details about education, because it's a very important subject. But what we have to keep in mind is, let us come together as African intellectuals and transform the educational system into the tool that will serve us African people in our agenda of African liberation. How should I say? Let us transform education as a tool for African liberation, rather than being used or transformed into tools of capitalist industry by the education that we are receiving. So that statement alone explains a lot of things. So there's a need to reform the educational system in Africa, and not just to reform education in Zambia, in Angola alone. No, we need a collective, we need a uniform educational system, really designed according to the resources that we have in Africa, according to the African reality, so that that education can respond to the needs of African people. Can you imagine you studying in Europe, you're studying within an environment which is not your original environment, and then when you come with that education you have received from Europe, you bring it to Africa, is useless. And that's the reason why, to finish, when at the time of independence we had few educated Africans, but they managed to fight and gain the so-called African independence. Today we have millions of PhD in Africa. What do? Nothing. They do nothing. When you look at how Singapore, these other countries are really advancing themselves, developing technology and mastering their own reality, and look at what Africa does when Russia calls, all the Negroes in Africa, the head of states, go there to crawl around Putin so that Putin can give them some grains. Even when Turkey calls, all of the leaders go there, to ask, to beg, right? Even though when you bring the GDP of Africa together and GDP of Russia, Africa has got more money than Russia. But why do we seem to be so ineffective? Simply because we don't have a proper educational system. We have to redesign this educational system and create a collective or uniform educational system, as I said, fits according to the reality of Africa, so that this education can respond to the needs of Africans. Because the current education we receive is ineffective in Africa. We have a lot of PhD in Africa, but they do nothing. Africa really, it seems to be going nowhere, while other people are conquering the space, as we are still doing the prototypes of motorbikes and upload that, or of those things that we see on the internet. Oh, this African has invented a new phone. No, man, phones are there already. I mean, you don't have to invent a phone. You just need to take a blueprint that the Chinese are using. Buy a Chinese phone, buy an American phone, open it, start it, and create your phone. Let's go ahead. We don't have to celebrate it, because those are already things of yesterday. We are looking into AI, looking in other dimensions, looking on how to conquer the space. These are the things that the world's looking into. So we need to remain celebrating when an African person comes up with a computer that looks like a caterpillar, and we say, no, this engine, no, man, come on, that's too low. Sometimes I don't even understand why we celebrate those kind of things. No, we need to upgrade, we need to move forward, and we need to redesign education that will empower us to be able to do that. Well, I hope this was useful to you, and if it is, please share the video, like and subscribe. If you haven't done that, support us at the ACUP in what we are doing. Any support is welcome, can help us to enlarge our influence and reach as many people as we want, because this agenda of African liberation and emancipation requires all African working together collectively. If you have two shoes, please sell one and buy a sword, because now it is time for revolution. And this revolution is not on the streets. This revolution is firstly in the mind, because if we are not in charge of our mind, the person who controls our mind then will control our bodies and make us the tools of self-destruction. Steve Bantu Biko said that the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. So wake up, Africans. Let us come together for this revolution and make it successful. Peace and power, freedom and decolonization. See you next time.